favor before you, O Lord, my rock and redeemer. I loved the back porch of my parents' home in Trenton, where I grew up, the house I was raised in. It wasn't very much of a yard. It was about 3 foot square, so it was in the city. It was really a slab of concrete. But I loved that place. When I was younger, because it was kind of secluded and had concrete walls around it, I went out there to be alone and to think and to look at the stars, take my telescope out and look at the stars. Talk to my buddy Mark, who lived across the alley, up in the window. And sometimes when I was older, I would go out there and smoke a cigar. But I don't do that anymore. In the spring, 23 years ago, I was sitting on that same back porch. This time I wasn't alone. I was with Christine, the woman who would become my wife later in that year. And I was in the final process of transitioning from the Roman priesthood to the Franciscan order. It sounds all very nice and concise to call it a transition, but it was the hardest time of my life. And the most painful and challenging part I had to consider was how to reconcile why, in my understanding of priesthood, I had to choose between the celibate life and married life. Why couldn't the two coexist? I was raised Roman Catholic and trained that the clerical priesthood was a special state, somehow more on an inside track to the divine, and only one who was set aside and consecrated could really be the conduit between God and the faithful. A narrow conception of priesthood, to be sure, but one in which I believed that if I remained steadfast in my vocation, I would remain a celibate priest for the rest of my life. Well, there I was, sitting on the back porch with the woman I love, not exactly the poster child for Roman Catholic vocations. The core of what I'm trying to say tonight is intimately linked to the meaning of this evening's celebration. And because of it, I stand here a very different person than the one who sat on that porch many years ago. What's the core question? In my case, the question was priesthood or marriage. In our case tonight, I think the question is ministry imparted or ministry shared. Do we climb Jacob's ladder, or do we dance in Sarah's circle, as Matthew Fox, the theologian, says? Transitions are really hard. Reconstructing and redefining one's life and identity is very, very difficult. And this evening's commemoration is one of those transitional moments in our salvation history. For the Jesus, for his disciples, and for us 2,000 years later. Imagine what it must have felt like as Jesus sat there with his friends at that table. Picture that image in your mind. Perhaps he had a sense of the tension mounting around him. Perhaps he knew what was about to occur that evening and the next day and the days to follow. But whether or not he fully understood what he was about to do or that he was facing his death, it really doesn't matter. What matters is what he did for the disciples and for us that's commemorated that evening. Until recently, in the last 22 years, I guess, Holy Thursday was, for me, always about the institution of priesthood. What mattered to me were the other priests, the men gathered at the table. We were the inside circle, Jesus' executive committee. My brother priests and I were taking the place of the disciples who were at that Last Supper, and who would become bishops and then ordain priests and eventually ordain me. Pretty nice and neat. Within that context, the washing of the feet took on a tone of communal affirmation. Look at how much we love each other. Look at our commitment to service to God's people. Look at our humility. From my current vantage point, I look at the foot washing less as a symbol of an ecclesiastically or clerically sponsored ministry, and more as a visible sign of the Eucharistic life that common life of our church. Why? Unlike Matthew and Mark and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, the Gospel of John does not have an institution narrative. Those words about bread and wine, body and blood, take this and eat. Not in John's Gospel. Instead, in John's text tonight, he's with his disciples. Jesus got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Bending down, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around them. Notice the level of detail and the importance of that. We're reading John's Gospel, remember. John is really big on details and wants to make points about the details he's making in the story. He gets up, Jesus does, takes off his robe, washes the feet with a towel that touches his own body. And when it's all over, after Peter has leveled his objection about the whole affair, Jesus tells them, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for that's what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you have to do the same for each other. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done to you." John is challenging us in this gospel text to follow Christ's example, to emulate precisely what Jesus did in that foot washing. Precisely. Each time feet are washed on Holy Thursday, we reenact a pure and true imitation of Christ and his mission in action. To be immersed into the mystery of Christ reveals tonight that we are required, we're compelled to bend down like Christ. Remember Philippians that we heard this past Sunday. For though he was in the form of God, Jesus did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at. Rather, he emptied himself and took the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and it was thus that he humbled himself. For in Christ's bending down, he offers a demonstration of what it means to be both authentically human and thus authentically divine. It is to love, to give of oneself without thought of how we look, how people may interpret it, what people do to us when they encounter such radical love. This is the ultimate mystery of foot washing. And the song that we're going to sing tonight during the foot washing testifies. Ubi caritas et amor. We sang it coming up the steps tonight. Where there is charity and love, there is God. So I think tonight in my heart, only through the literal imitation of Christ, in imitation of a love that takes off its outer garment and stoops down to tenderly wash our feet, only then can we enter fully into the gift and mystery of the Eucharist. Sure, it's easy to gather for a meal, break bread, share a cup. We did it downstairs a little while ago. Quite nice and quite lovely. We have no problem imitating Jesus in that way. It's a lot more difficult to get up from that table, shed our masks and our barriers, our preconceptions and prejudices, and wash each other's feet. A lot harder. The command given to us on Maundy Thursday is to link the actions of meal and foot washing. Because this linkage forever shifts the power base from ministry bestowed to ministry shared. It tears down the ladder on which we race to climb to more mystical heights in a sort of spiritual Olympics. Instead, we strive to link arms with each other in a dance that is inclusive and joyful and that always has room for one more, where color or shape or orientation makes no difference. This is the mystery to which we're called to imitate. God's love wantonly revealed in human action, in water, in bread and wine, and in those most in need of love, including ourselves. My vision today, 23 years removed from that porch, says that there can be no Eucharist without foot washing. We are, all of us here, the priests of Jesus Christ. Those with the title of Reverend and those without, those who are celibate for the kingdom and those who are not. One does not exclude or outweigh the other in the same way that Eucharist and foot washing cannot outweigh or exclude the other. One without the other makes the other incomplete. Shortly, you'll receive the invitation to come forward to wash each other's feet. In this action, we're invited to do exactly as Jesus did, as he humbled himself in washing his disciples' feet and commanding them to do the same. In the humble sharing of himself as bread and wine, his humble emptying himself on the cross, all these commands are linked and are ours for the journey. There is no longer any barrier or special requirements or secret handshake or special orders. So come forward, wash feet, share the bread and the cup. This is how we celebrate our common life in Christ. May we, like Jesus, humble ourselves. Consider a paraphrase of the words Jesus spoke to his friends at the table that night. Imagine that you're saying them to the persons around you in the seats. You say to your neighbor, "You call me your sister or brother, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your sister or brother, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash my feet. For I have set you an example, that you also should do as I have done to you. For as often as we wash and eat and drink, we proclaim the Lord's resurrection